Margaret Wilson had been the CEO of Hartwell Industries for 12 years now, and every morning she walked through those familiar lobby doors with the same quiet determination that had carried her through decades of hard work and careful decisions. The elevator ride to the 15th floor had become her daily moment of peace before the meetings and phone calls began, and today felt no different as she pressed the button and waited for the familiar ding. As the doors slid open, she noticed young Timothy Rodriguez already inside, holding his father's hand and looking up at her with those bright, curious eyes that reminded her so much of her own grandson back in Ohio. Timothy was 8 years old and came to work with his father Carlos every Saturday morning when school was out, and his mother Maria worked her shift at the hospital. Carlos Rodriguez had been the night janitor at Hartwell Industries for 7 years, and Margaret had exchanged pleasant greetings with him countless times, though their conversations never went much beyond hello and thank you. Today Timothy tugged on his father's sleeve and whispered something in Spanish that made Carlos shake his head gently and say, "No, my Joe, not now." But Timothy looked directly at Margaret with that earnest expression children get when they have something important to say, and he opened his mouth to speak. "Don't talk," he said quietly but firmly. Margaret felt her eyebrows raise in surprise, and she looked at Carlos, who appeared mortified and began apologizing immediately. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Wilson, he doesn't mean to be rude, he just—" But Margaret held up her hand with a gentle smile, because something in Timothy's eyes told her there was more to this story. "It's all right, Carlos," she said softly. "Timothy, what did you want to tell me?" The little boy looked up at his father, who nodded reluctantly, and then Timothy took a deep breath. "My papa says you have a sad voice when you talk on the phone," Timothy said with the brutal honesty that only children possess. "He says you sound lonely like my Abula did before she went to heaven." Margaret felt something catch in her throat, because out of the mouths of babes came truths that adults spent years trying to ignore. She had been lonely these past few months since her divorce was finalized and her children moved to different states for their careers, leaving her in this big empty house with only her work to fill the silence. "Papa cleans your office every night," Timothy continued, "and he says you stay very late and sometimes you talk to the pictures on your desk like they were real people." Carlos looked like he wanted to disappear through the elevator floor, but Margaret found herself oddly comforted by the fact that someone had noticed her solitude, even if it was the quiet man who emptied her wastebasket each evening. "Timothy has something he wants to give you," Carlos said quietly, "but I told him it wasn't appropriate." Margaret looked down at the little boy who was clutching something in his small fist, and she knelt down to his level despite her expensive suit. "What is it, sweetheart?" Timothy opened his hand to reveal a small wooden cross no bigger than a quarter that had been worn smooth by countless fingers. "My Abula gave this to me before she died," he said. "She said it would help with the lonely feelings, and I thought maybe you need it more than I do right now." Margaret felt tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed in months begin to well up in her eyes, because sometimes the greatest acts of kindness come from the most unexpected places. "Oh Timothy," she whispered, "this is very special. I couldn't take something so precious from you. But Papa says sharing is caring, and Abula always said God gives us things so we can give them to people who need them more." The elevator reached the 15th floor, but none of them moved to get out. Margaret looked at Carlos, who was watching his son with a mixture of pride and embarrassment, and she realized that this little family had been quietly observing her life and caring about her well-being in ways she never imagined. "Your son is very wise," she said to Carlos, "and very kind, just like his father." She accepted the small cross from Timothy and felt its warmth against her palm like a tiny promise that she wasn't as alone as she thought. "Would you and Timothy like to come have coffee in my office?" she asked Carlos. "I mean, if you have time before your cleaning duties." Carlos looked surprised, but Timothy immediately brightened up and said, "Can we, Papa, please?" And so began an unlikely friendship between a CEO who had forgotten how to be vulnerable and a janitor who had been quietly demonstrating dignity and compassion all along. In Margaret's office, Timothy sat in the big leather chair behind her desk and pretended to be important while Carlos and Margaret talked about their children and their dreams and the small struggles that make up most people's daily lives. Margaret learned that Carlos had been saving money to take night classes in accounting because he wanted to give Timothy better opportunities than cleaning offices could provide. She learned that Timothy was brilliant at math but struggled with reading because English was his second language and the school didn't have enough resources for extra help. And Carlos learned that Margaret had grown up poor in a small town where her father worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, and she had never forgotten what it felt like to worry about making ends meet. When Timothy found the family photos on her desk, he asked about each person and listened carefully as Margaret talked about her children and grandchildren who lived so far away. "Don't you miss them?" he asked, with that direct way children have of cutting through adult pretenses. "Every day," Margaret admitted. "Then why don't you visit them more?" Timothy asked. It was such a simple question, but it made Margaret realize she had been so busy building walls around her loneliness that she had forgotten to build bridges to the people she loved. That afternoon Margaret made phone calls she had been putting off for months, and by the end of the day she had plane tickets to visit her daughter in Seattle and plans for her grandchildren to spend 2 weeks with her that summer. Carlos started his accounting classes the following semester with tuition assistance from a scholarship program Margaret had quietly arranged through the company. Timothy got extra reading help from a volunteer tutor that Margaret connected the family with through her church. And every Saturday morning when Timothy came to work with his father, Margaret made sure to ride the elevator with them and listen to whatever wisdom an 8-year-old boy wanted to share. Sometimes the most profound changes in our lives come not from grand gestures or dramatic moments, but from the quiet kindness of people who see us when we think we are invisible. Margaret kept Timothy's grandmother's cross on her desk next to the family photos, and every time she looked at it she remembered that loneliness is not a permanent condition but simply a temporary forgetting of how connected we all really are. Years later, when Timothy graduated from college with a business degree and Carlos had become the head of facilities management, Margaret would tell people that some of her best business decisions came from the advice of an 8-year-old boy who taught her that true leadership begins with recognizing the humanity in everyone around us. The cross still sits on her desk today, a small wooden reminder that sometimes the greatest gifts come in the smallest packages, and that kindness shared multiplies in ways we can never fully measure but always deeply feel.